Welcome everyone to the Plant Conservation Alliance meeting for July. I'm pleased to introduce to you today Dr. Jeremy Pinto, a research physiologist with the U.S. Forest Service. Jeremy works at the Rocky Mountain Research Station, and his research focuses mainly on nursery cultural practices and their effects on the establishment and subsequent growth of reforestation and restoration plant materials. Jeremy also serves as a tribal nursery specialist on the National Reforestation Nurseries and Genetic Resources team. In this role, he provides technical assistance to tribal nurseries as well as managing the Intertribal Nursery Council. Please join me in welcoming Jeremy Pinto today, who will speak with us about nursery-produced native plant seedlings, a valuable tool in the toolbox of landscape and cultural restoration. Thanks, Jeremy.
All right. Just real quick, I guess you can hear me okay, Patricia?
Yes, we can. And I'm
okay,
sorry, I meant to glossed over Q&A will be at the end, but folks can put their questions in the chat. We'll read those at the end.
And then also the slide is correctly displayed as well. Always good to double check that. So thank you so much. Okay. Here we go. Thank you for the introduction. It's a privilege to be here. Thanks for allowing me to be a part of this meeting and talk about some of the and geek out about plants with plant people, I think is the main thing. I appreciate the opportunity and sharing the room with like-minded folks. As Patricia mentioned, I get to talk about nursery-produced native plant materials. As we all know, in the context of restoration, and I know the title says landscape and cultural restoration, but I think I'm going to kind of cover the restoration topic largely, and even in small scale attributes as well. But when it comes to restoration, and plant materials, there are quite a few options. Well, three specifically come to mind. If you're engaging in a restoration project and you want to put plant materials on that project, you have basically the option of direct seeding. You can also, in the right context, rely on natural regeneration. And in the context of this talk, you can get nursery-produced seedlings to help you accomplish your restoration goals for your intended purposes as well. So when you're looking at a project, you might have the option of using a combination of all three, or maybe selecting one over the other. And you might have the, so it begs the question, which plant material is correct? It depends. And then really, for all three of those options, the right material in the right place at the right time will work. But the main thing is to think about your objectives and think about the considerations of using each one of those strategies, whether it's seeds or nurseries or natural regen, and deciding whether or not it's applicable or appropriate for your project. I gave a talk like this just earlier this year at the Society for Range Management. And the context I stole directly, this slide from that talk, was talking about restoring after large fires in rangelands, and specifically I was working towards Great Basin application in this regard. And so when you're thinking about using plant materials in this type of a situation, you have some pretty good considerations involved, including area covered, which can be a large area, as you see from that lower right picture, to your budget, to the timing, and to your available resources. And so in some cases, it may not be appropriate to use nursery-produced plant materials to cover this large area, and you may not have the time and the resources to do so. But there are some applications in which you want to use plant materials from the nursery. And when you do so, it's good to follow some general guidelines and follow some of the concepts that we've turned to over the years and developed over the years to help you achieve the goals that you're looking for. So right place, right material, right place, right time applies to seeds, nurseries, and natural regen. Again, it's just kind of taking your situation and distilling which one is best in which area. So again, from that previous example, it might not make sense, or it doesn't make sense to use nursery plant materials for that whole entire area, but you can use nursery materials for certain objectives within that area, including high priority areas in there, and or in areas where you might be able to get ecosystem services a little bit faster if you use nursery produced plant materials. In some cases, when you do direct seeds, you can use seed mixes, but you can't always control the germination of what's going on in those seed mixes. So you can also select certain biological diversity to go in these areas and actually grow those materials in the greenhouse to get what you need. Also, too, you can overlay traditional and cultural needs. If you have some areas that are of sensitivity or of importance, you can also use some materials for that. And I'll cover the pretty much kind of the last part of my talk is about using nursery plant materials in a cultural context as my part of my job description, or one portion of my job is working with tribes who grow nursery plants for reforestation and restoration. So there's, in the context of that rangeland fire situation, there really is some areas where you can focus some energy with some nursery produced seedlings. And I have some graphics here that kind of show how you might use these things in combination with direct seeding, for example. So why use nursery stock? Maybe this is apparent to a lot of you, but I'll explain a little bit why we use nursery stock in some situations. This is just an example I pulled from growing tree seedlings. So on the left, we have some naturally generated conifer seedlings, and I took this picture at a field, one of my field sites this year. These seedlings are just now entering their second growing season. They were established naturally, and as they stand, they are about 1 to 2.5 centimeters in height. They're doing fairly well right now. They've germinated and they've reached their first level of establishment, but they still have a ways to go before they're starting to produce any kind of a tree-like structure or ecosystem services or any of that nature. In the picture in the middle that you see there, these are seedlings that very well could be produced from that same seed source, but they spent one season in the greenhouse. And obviously they're a lot bigger. We have learned over the years that we can flex the muscles, so to speak, of the genetics and flex the phenotypes of these seedlings to create larger seedlings in a short amount of time. These have been grown one season in the greenhouse, and they're 15 to 30 centimeters in height and have some fairly decent root systems. Of course, they're nursery produced seedlings, so their seedling root systems are a little bit different than what you would see in the field, but this is the nursery versus nature scenario. Little tiny things that may take a little while, or we can, again, flex the plastic nature of what these seedlings are capable of by providing the optimal nutrients and environment to grow in, and create something fairly substantial that can be planted for some immediate effects, or maybe not so much immediate effects, but for effects that can be seen quicker in some situations. And again, it really kind of depends on the restoration context that you're working in. So this tool in the toolbox, and as opposed to relying on natural regeneration for a particular area, you can actually get some nursery seedlings of substantial size and put them on the landscape and start to see some of the functions in a shorter amount of time. This is a site that I planted in Southeast Oregon. These are sagebrush seedlings grown one season, and when we outplanted them, they were probably about 15 centimeters tall, about 6 inches tall. And we planted them in this range scenario where there was it was pretty barren, it was pretty grazed over. And what we kind of hope to do is cluster them in this area so we could kind of get some microclimate effects a lot quicker. And in short order, we had seedlings with really good success rate. You can see these here have grown quite a bit. And in that previous picture, we had some snow there, but now in this state, maybe this is like, I think this is maybe about a year later, they grew pretty good. You can see that they've actually already started creating a little bit of microhabitat there. So these seedlings are catching drifting snow, which is influencing the soil moisture there. Some of these seedlings are already producing flowers, and so those will create some natural regen situations. And also too, that microhabitat is already buzzing around with insects and other little things crawling around in there, as opposed to some of those open areas you see in the background. So that was in pretty short order. And in this particular situation, some natural regeneration might be inhibited because, you know, there are some cows there, there's some animals, there's some other harsh growth conditions that might prevent that natural regen from providing structure and function right away. So to branch out, just to show a little bit more about in another situation, this is a tropical situation in Hawaii, where we decided that nursery produced seedlings were a viable tool in the toolbox, so to speak. We were looking at an area of an area that used to have montane forests and was converted to rangeland and is now coated with this lower left-hand picture with a whole bunch of invasive grasses, thick carpet of invasive grasses. So in terms of natural regen, there aren't many trees nearby, in fact, none. So we won't really see anything there. If we tried to direct seed in this area, those seeds would just get swallowed up and sit at the bottom of this thatch and probably have a hard time growing. But in this case, it's like, hey, let's put some nursery stock in there, and let's do an experiment too, where we put it in just with the grass, and then we do some site prep too, and kind of knock back the grass with some herbicide, and see if we can accomplish our goal. And our goal was to quickly create forests to create closed canopy for wildlife mitigation. And so with that, with some of the seedlings that we put in there, man, then koa grow really rapidly, by the way. We saw closed canopy really quickly, and closed canopy is really good for some of the endangered birds that are on the island there. So this tool, the toolbox in this application, is really good at what does this title say? At accelerating the restoration trajectory of this site, so to speak. So so that's just one of the reasons why I think nursery stock is a good option, can be a good option in a couple of different scenarios. And so here's where I start to talk about how to use nursery stock effectively, and a concept that will help you help guide the process to help you make some choices and make the right decisions. Now, if I was in person and I could see all of you right now, I'd like to interact and say, raise your hand if you have ever heard of the target plant concept. And unfortunately, there's no way I can tell. maybe in the chat. Yes, I know what it is, or no, I don't. The target plant concept is a really cool. Oh, I see a hand wave in the bottom. Cool, Pete, the guest. All right, good job. The target plant concept is a really cool concept that I say is a holistic approach to plant material development and deployment. This concept came from forestry, but I'll illustrate how adaptable it is here in a minute. What this concept does is it really helps you target specific attributes of the seedling that are going to be beneficial on your outplanting site. So we go beyond this very historical practice of where you have a need for seedlings, you go to the nursery to get the seedlings, and then you outplant the seedlings, and then whatever happens, you have poor success rate. Now we take this historically linear process, and we start to curve it around and make a circular process and say, what can we do now instead of just getting seedlings from the greenhouse? What can we do now and design our own seedlings and create a positive feedback loop so that we can learn from our experiences and grow the best seedling and do better with each iteration? And that is like targeting specific attributes of these plants for their specific purposes. And we realize that there is no one size fits all. Again, it's going away from that linear process and realizing that we have control. We should have control of this whole process of growing and deployment to maximize our success. So why do I like the target plant concept so much? I mean, I really love this. I've given a lot of talks about this. It's very comprehensive. It's a roadmap. It's about giving you a roadmap for your journey. It's making sure you make all the right turns in all the right places, or if you have choices, making sure you identify all the choices that you have and making a good choice for the next road that you're taking. It's very adaptable. Again, it came from forestry, but it's very adaptable to restoration. And I've even found and seen where and implemented where it's very adaptable on a cultural level as well. It's adaptable for climate change if you're starting to think about climate change and implementation for that into your restoration projects using plant materials. And also for me as a scientist, I think it's great because I can generate a lot of questions of research topic questions just from this concept alone, as you'll see. And yeah, to help people along their journeys when they're coming across questions or problems in this journey, so to speak. So here it is, the target plant concept in all of its complex figurative glory. I mentioned it being a circle. In this figure, it's very vertical, but you see at the bottom, the arrow goes around and points to the top. It's meant to be a feedback process, a loop where you learn continuously from it. So I'll start from the top to explain a little bit. The concept is guided by three overarching principles or three ideas. And I think these are really important. The first is that the nursery and the client need to have a partnership and they need to communicate with one another. Again, get away from that linear process about just going and getting what you get, what is there to be offered. Communicate with your nursery to talk about what you need and what it is they're good at growing, and communicate through the whole process of growing these plants. That's ideal. The second idea is that outplanting site is what dictates a lot of what you're thinking about when you're designing your target plant. You have a project already, right? You know what's on your site. You want to start looking at what's on that site and developing a plan for how the nursery is going to grow a plant specifically catered to that site. The third thing, and I'll get more into that a little bit later. And the third thing is that quality is a really important attribute. And if you don't have quality plants coming out of the greenhouse for your project, you're already starting off in a worse situation. So the next level of the concept is about answering all these questions that are interrelated that help you actually define what it is that plant is and what it looks like and how it's going to function. So you know your project objectives. You have to go to your outplanting site. You look at your outplanting site and you figure out what your limiting factors are on that outplanting site. Of course, you want to make sure you select the most appropriate species for your project, and you want to make sure you have the appropriate genetic sources. I won't talk about species and genetic sources so much for this talk, but I'll talk a little bit about limiting factors. I'll talk a little bit about stock type too. Stock type is a nursery technical term that we use that is kind of a descriptor of like the age and the size and the shape, so to speak, of what your plant materials are. And the next few slides, I'll talk a little bit more about that. Outplanting tools and techniques are important, and I think maybe this is often overlooked. There are so many different types of outplanting tools out there. It does make a difference which one you choose and how you use it to ensure that plant has the best opportunity to survive and grow after you plant it. Excuse me, I don't have much time to talk about that, but it is important. If you want to learn more about it, I can certainly interact with you later. Also, there are some techniques that you can use in terms of site prep and or site mitigation that will help your seedlings survive, whether you're doing some stuff ahead of time prior to planting or whether you're doing some stuff after you've planted to mitigate some of the limiting factors, whether it is you're knocking back some of the competing vegetation or whether you're putting up browse protection to keep your seedlings from getting munched on by animals after you plant them. Outplanting window is important also. Of course, this seems like a no-brainer, but you definitely want to be planting seedlings when it's favorable for them to establish and grow. Like you don't want to be planting at the beginning of a drought, for example, or a seasonal drought, for example. So taking all those things into consideration, you communicate with your nursery and say, hey, this is what I think we need to grow. And the nursery says, hey, cool, this is how I think we can grow your seedlings. They grow the plants, you put them out on the outplanting site, you evaluate them after a couple of years, and then you start all over again with the knowledge you've learned and you do it better next time, ideally, right? So here's another little graphic that illustrates the target plant concept and a selfish plug for a paper that we wrote with a little more detail if you guys want to go on your own and learn a little bit more about the target plant concept. So Limiting factors on the outplanting side is where I wanted to spend a little bit of time today, because I think this is where I think the rubber meets the road, so to speak, when it comes to getting nursery materials to survive and grow on the landscape. When I was preparing for the Rangeland Society for Range Management meeting, I was chatting with a colleague, and we were talking about establishing nursery produced plants, and he gave me a quote that was kind of fun. He said, "There are 10 ways to kill a plant and only one way to keep it alive." And I thought that was really funny. I was like, yeah, man, that is true. Everything wants to kill your plant. And then I started thinking about it more. I'm like, there's probably actually more than 10 things that want to kill your plant. But I also thought there are quite a few things you can do, more than one thing, to keep it alive. And that's what understanding limiting factors is. This list on the right here is, in my mind, a lot of the things that might cause problems for your plant to survive and grow on the outplanting site. There's quite a few, and this isn't an all exhaustive list either. But there are things that you can do to mitigate some of the problems here that you can come across. The concept of limiting factors is that there's always more than one. There could be 10, there could be more than 10, but that the effect is sequential and cumulative in nature. But the priority here, the take-home message is usually there are a few really, really important ones that you can address in your target plant formulation that will help you overcome those barriers. Like primarily, I think some of the main limiting factors that I've looked at and studied are water and temperature, for example. Understanding how water dynamics change over the site over periods of time, and what the plant does in response to that water availability, or how you can mitigate plant responses to changing water on the outplanting site. So, for example, if you know water is limiting, you might change your stock type to address that mitigation. This is just a little bit about stock type choice. I'll get more into what I just said just in a minute here. But understanding that when you're designing your target plant, you don't have to just settle for what's available. You can talk to nurseries, because nurseries are often really good at growing plants in a lot of different sizes and shapes. When it comes to container seedlings, when you look at the types of containers that are available on the market, there are tons, and it's really hard to decide which ones are available and which ones are the best for your application. When you're talking about bare root seedlings, there are quite a few options as well. You can have a 1-year-old seedling, you can have a 2-year-old seedling, you can have seedlings with tall shoots, you can have seedlings that have been they're hybridized, actually, or not hybridized, they're hybrid seedlings, in that they were produced for a short amount of time in the nursery and then they were outplanted into the bare root beds before they were grown out. And that's a specific stock type that has some benefits all its own. There's essentially a lot of choices, but understanding what those choices are and how they cater to your needs is what you're kind of more or less looking at. Let me see, I think, yeah, I talk a little bit about that in the next slide. But stock type choice, you have a bunch, so to speak, and your considerations are, starting at your outplanting site, think about what you need. Your outplanting site. Okay, do I have a lot of competing vegetation? If so, am I getting rid of it? And if I'm not getting rid of it, maybe I need a seedling that's a little bit taller so that it can compete for light. Or how do the moisture dynamics change on the site? Can I get away with a seedling with a short root plug because the soil is not that deep? Or do I need a seedling with a longer root plug to access soil moisture deeper in the soil profile? What you want to do is think about those things and then start talking to the nursery and see what they're good at growing that are more closer to what your needs are. Like in this example that I have here on the screen is sagebrush. You might be working with a nursery that can grow sagebrush in these particular types of containers called styroblocks, and they can grow some really great stock varieties in these containers. But let's say in your mind you had that you wanted to grow in this 10 cubic inch Ray Leach container. Maybe the nursery doesn't have the right conditions to grow those seedlings to the targets that you want. And they might look like this, for example, which is not what you had in mind. So you want to kind of develop your targets in your head, work with your nursery to figure out how they can leverage their strengths to get you what you want. And then also too, think about economics. Small seedlings are cheaper than larger seedlings, and small seedlings are easier to plant than larger seedlings. And so that comes into factor as well. Another economic factor that was that one of my colleagues covered in one talk a few years ago was just talking about the difference between bare root and container seedlings. A lot of nurseries, or the Forest Service nurseries and several nurseries that I know, have both the capacity to produce a container seedling and or have bare root beds to produce bare root seedlings. And a lot of folks like container seedlings because in general you can have higher survival, but they do cost more. And a lot of times too, a lot of the nurseries have the greenhouses are already full, like they can't grow any more container seedlings, but the bare roots beds aren't full. And in that sense, they have capacity to grow more bare root seedlings. And even though they might have lower survival, they're cheaper to produce and they're cheaper cost. So maybe you can change your target plant strategy and where you can buy more seedlings knowing that you're going to get just a little bit more mortality and still achieve the same stocking level at relatively the same cost. Okay, so again, stock type choice goes into some of those considerations as well. You can also maybe check the literature to see if you can find some stock type studies that have been done that might cover the situation that you're looking for. I got interested in this when I was in grad school because a question was posed about the length of root systems and whether or not certain lengths, adding length to root systems was actually beneficial to certain stock. In this case, it was a ponderosa pine. So we were looking at some containers, and the idea is that, well, if you plant these at the right time, they should be able to grow roots to keep up with the drying soil horizon. And so root length really shouldn't matter. And so we started to investigate this and thinking along the lines of changing climate and increasing drought intensity and timing and whatnot. We investigated, what if the site situation was good? What if the site situation was experiencing drought and a quick drought? What if there was competing vegetation? And indeed, when we looked at this study, we found that an additional 2 inches of root length meant the difference between life or death for these poor seedlings. So essentially, I created this trial and I created a controlled torture environment where I had things dry out fairly rapidly in one case and not so rapidly. And the poor seedlings with the short root systems just didn't do well at all. So fortunately, in some cases, you can look to the literature and find some studies that may be suitable to what you're looking for to help you develop your stock type choice. I want to talk a little bit about plant material timelines and the context of restoration. I mean, restoration can happen in a lot of different timelines where in one sense you have a project that you're working on that's a little bit more long-term. In some cases, you're working on projects where you're responding to wildfire events or whatnot, and you need to do something quickly. In those quick response times, I think a lot of those, you look towards direct seeding or natural regeneration to facilitate your re-veg strategies. But again, if you're looking to use nursery plant materials, it's often hard to find the stock that you need in those short timelines. But if you're looking for producing nursery stock for some of those high priority areas or some of those areas that I illustrated earlier in the talk, it's good to think about how long it might take to get the stock that you need. Again, this is just an example related to the range talk that I gave using big sagebrush. So, if you get a fire in the summer and, you're looking at putting some seedlings into some high priority areas, you're looking at planting in October, for example. Let's say that's your planting window. You're going to already have to have had seed that's appropriate for that site, or you're going to have to look at getting seed that fall. And then you have this seed collection time, cleaning time, and storage time before you begin to even grow the seedlings and then harden the seedlings and then have the seedlings ready for outplanting. So that timeline is more than 1 year. And so oftentimes this doesn't really bode well for annual budget cycles, but it's good to keep this in mind if you're starting to think about talking about using nursery produced plant materials. Okay, so let's see, moving on. I'll shift a little gears to talk a little bit about quality. Of course, we like to have high quality seedlings. Fitness for purpose is something that we talk about when we talk about quality seedlings. Again, you know, you've given these seedlings everything they need in the nursery to do the job on the outplanting site, and communicating with your nursery, knowing that they know how to implement the correct growing regimes and everything possible, you'll get something that's of high quality when you need it. But we have a lot of things, a lot of metrics that we use to describe quality, and I'll kind of break this down into two, with morphological attributes and we have physiological attributes. And in my mind, I think in a beauty is only skin deep kind of a scenario. Really, you know, a seedling can look really good, but we don't know what's going on underneath, which is of utmost importance. However, the conundrum is that in nursery production, the morphological attributes are the ones that are easiest to measure, that help us define what quality is. Now, so fortunately, we've done a lot of studies where we've correlated a lot of these morphological attributes with some of the physiological attributes that we feel are important. So when we look at some species in production, we look at some of them needing to be certain heights. Those heights might correspond to something like leaf area, which corresponds with photosynthesis potential, for example. We might look at stem diameter as being a quality metric as well. Stem diameter being the connection of the piping of the water systems of the roots to the leaves, and those piping systems, those stem diameters might be correlated to robust root systems, for example. So these are important quality metrics, but really I think the physiological ones are the ones that are most important. But from a production standpoint, those are the ones that are hardest to measure. But you know, in some cases, you can tell by looking at some seedlings whether they have nutrition compromise or not. Like they might be chlorotic versus nice and green, for example. I have this interesting photo here on the right of it's just and this is kind of a unique scenario, but it kind of illustrates this idea of you can have quality seedlings in the nursery, leaving the nursery, but quality can be degraded from the time they leave the nursery to the time they're put in the ground. Quality can also be degraded within the nursery unknowingly, but you can have a seedling that looks great, but not know something's wrong. And this picture is just kind of one of those unique scenarios that just we happen to come across. These are cross sections of a ponderosa pine seedling that were acquired by Dr. Brandon Pratt at the University of California, and he had a cool machine, a micro CT scanner, where he could look 3-dimensionally and 2-dimensionally at the anatomy of the stem sections of these seedlings. So he started taking pictures of these seedlings, and they looked fine, and they were slated for outplanting. But he started taking pictures, and you can see they are kind of cool pictures, but you could see the outer layers, you could see phloem, cambium, you could see xylem, but he started to notice this pattern of this dark ring, as you see in these two different seedlings, occurring in each and every one of the seedlings. Now what that dark ring is, and to the untrained eye, mine was untrained at first, but that is xylem that is cavitated xylem. So that xylem is no longer functional. When plants get water stressed, the xylem, which are the piping network that carry water from the roots through the shoots to the leaves, the xylem gets under tension and those water columns snap, or they pop, or they break. And when they do, they become non-functional. And so basically you're losing some of your valuable piping system that helps keep that plant alive. And so the interesting thing to me was that these plants had compromised xylem before they were even going into the ground, but you would not have known that. And we started to think about anything could have happened to them. Like, for example, these are pea pine in the nursery. You know, if someone forgot to water them for a period of time, they could have stressed out, and you may not have been able to tell from a visual standpoint, but they may have been stressed out in the nursery too much and they lost some of their xylem. They could have been stressed when they were being packed. They could have been stressed during the storage process. They could have desiccated. Maybe a bag was left open. Maybe they were left in the bag on the loading dock too long. Maybe they were stuck in a hot van for transport. You know, any one of these things could have happened. But essentially, when you're unpacking these bags, you have the seedling that looks okay, you put it in the ground and it dies, and not quite sure why. This is why it is important to say, let's strive for the highest quality we can coming out of the nursery, but also let's take care of these seedlings at every step along the way to ensure that quality is there when it goes in the ground. So I can't emphasize that enough. Just one quick other story related to quality as well. In those stressful events of leaving the nursery and getting put into the ground, there was a study that was done a while back where some seedlings were packed into boxes, and the investigation was to see what dropping impact of those boxes would do to seedling quality and survival. And so seedlings were put into boxes. They were dropped from 1 meter. They were dropped from ½ meter, 1 meter, 1.5 meters, 2 meters. So essentially, you're taking these boxes of seedlings, dropping them on the ground. Is that going to have an effect? And in fact, it actually did. So the seedlings that were dropped from like 1 meter and above showed significant reductions in survival. So rough handling seedlings had an effect on quality and subsequent survival down the road. So careful how you treat your seedlings. Seed use efficiency this is an example that was penciled out by my colleague, Dr. Cass Dumrose. This is just another way to think about whether we want to use direct seeding methods or what are the advantages of using nursery produced seedlings. This is just for the purposes of illustration. Let's say you have a 40-hectare plot and Munro's Globe Mallow is the plant of choice that you're looking at restoring there. 40 hectares, and you want to have so many plants established per hectare. When you're direct seeding, you're generally looking at low germination rates, pretty low germination rates. So when you do that, you have to factor in how many seeds do I want per hectare? How many seeds is that going to be on a per meter square basis? You have a certain number of seeds per pound. You start to do some calculations, and it looks like you're going to need, in this situation on his back of the napkin calculation, you're going to need 308 kilograms of seed to get the job done, to get the number of established plants that you want in the ground. If seed is valuable, or if seed is of high cost, or if seed is of low availability, you might not want to do the direct seeding method in this case. You can start to look at the nursery application. Same amount of land, same amount of desired seedlings on the ground, but now you're optimizing germination instead of letting it just ride on the site as it is. So you're optimizing the maximum germination rates, and you're sowing fewer seedlings or fewer seeds per container. You're using less seed and at a certain cost per pound. So like in this situation, you're looking at using less than 2 kilograms of seed versus a couple 100 pounds of seed. And so your seed cost not only goes down, your seed use efficiency goes up. And with the amount of seed you saved, if you're using nursery plant materials, you can actually use all the seed that you didn't use to restore more land. Of course, none of this really factors in the cost of the seedlings or the cost to put the seedlings in the ground. This also doesn't cover the cost of deploying the seed on a direct broadcast basis, but you get the point. The idea is that if seed is precious or seed is expensive, you can use this option in a more controlled scenario to maximize your seed use efficiency. So, okay, so that kind of concludes the first part of my talk, which is kind of, using nursery produced seedlings as a viable option for restoration. Now I'll shift gears towards kind of some of the other work that I do, and that is working with tribes to help grow nursery produced seedlings for their projects, their restoration reforestation projects. So as was mentioned in the introduction, I work on a team called Reforestation Nurseries and Genetic Resources Teams. The idea or the goal of this team is to provide nursery technical assistance to anybody growing seedlings, state, private, federal, and tribal nurseries, help them grow the best seedlings they can for the projects that they have. So it was noticed like 20 years ago, over 20 years ago, by one of the previous team members that the technical assistance program that was being implemented, though there were tribal nurseries out there, the technical assistance team wasn't really doing an effective job at working with the tribes and understanding what their needs were. And it was because as they learned back then, or as we've learned over time, is that we weren't considering the whole big picture of the restoration and cultural restoration and the cultural history that was there for why these tribes were using the plants or why these tribes were restoring the plants. It was this myopic view of just reforestation or just an ecological restoration project. And so it was important for our team to back then to hear the voices of what tribes were doing on their landscapes and why and what some of the barriers were, and then helped us to implement a better program so that we could maximize the nursery produced seedlings for what it is that they're doing. So just for the context of this talk, I thought I'd start, of course, we know back a long time ago when they were roaming this land, Native Americans had a rich history and connection with their plants. The plants kept them alive. It defined their culture. And it was obvious that they incorporated management techniques that were mutually beneficial for the plants and themselves. And so this history had some really original historical land management context. And I think that wasn't in the picture when we were having this technical assistance program over 20 years ago. This was kind of largely ignored. This is kind of where we were focusing. We were just focusing on the idea that we have greenhouses, we know how to grow big plants, we know how to put them out on the landscape, we know how to do reforestation, we can work on restoration projects. We know that there are new types of land management objectives, not only on indigenous land, but on everybody's landscape, boundaries and ownership and associations aside. So these native plants, these trees, everything were being produced in greenhouses for contemporary management applications. It wasn't about those historical ones at all. And these were being done using contemporary management techniques, modern tools and technology, science. So this is where we were focusing, right? The greenhouses, fancy tools, understanding fertilizer and irrigation and all this kind of stuff. But despite what was going on, despite the need for technical assistance here, one of the things that we were largely ignoring was that historical context and a new contemporary context, in that these plants aren't just plants, right? They're not just plants for reforestation, and they're not just plants for restoration, but these plants have a cultural history and they have a cultural connection, and they have other purposes besides just those ones that we were thinking about previously. So the team and our program, we had to realize, hey, look, like we're not contextualizing the whole thing here. We have to realize what the possibilities are and what the history was. So taking this into consideration, we can help tribes grow target plants for their intended projects. But this wasn't really an easy task. I mean, this was kind of like the first aspect, was identifying what these goals were and the historical and the contemporary context, but also understanding what the potential conflicts and the right paths forward were with working with tribes. So it was first good to acknowledge what the problems were, that largely traditional ecological knowledge was absent in this approach, and that there may be concerns about using culturally significant plants in these artificial environments. We heard from elders, medicinal practitioners, that in this artificial environment, you disrupt spirituality, you disrupt the connectedness. And even if you get past that, there's still this idea of what kind of fertilizers and what kind of pesticides are you using that might have downstream effects if someone is directly harvesting these plants later. What about genetics? A lot of these plants are being used because they have certain attributes that were desirable. So if you're introducing genetics from other areas, how are you changing what that structure looks like and what that function originally was and how it was used? So these conversations and these things start to come forward, and thinking about, wow, we have all these contemporary management ideals, and we think we know what we're doing, but we're figuring out that there's some cultural things that might cause some hiccups along the way. So we've got to find a balance, because we do need these plants. We do have new situations and where we have disturbance regimes that have vastly changed. We have anthropogenic changes on the landscape. We know how to grow plants in greenhouses, but how do we really fit some of that traditional stuff together and make it work? So the goal, produce plants in the right way, but use the science and technology we have and incorporate the traditional knowledge in doing so. Again, I mentioned this wasn't an easy task, and I kind of look around to see how it's being done elsewhere or what the ideas are on how to get this done. I came across this quote from the Society of Ecological Restoration, and it talks about this blending of science and traditional knowledge. And it says the successful integration will require a thorough and thoughtful synthesis where concepts are considered within their cultural context and not as bits of knowledge or information to be inserted into the prevailing scientific framework. And I was like, wow, oh, shoot, that doesn't really fit. But then, I start to think about it. It's like, well, the tribes already have the greenhouses and already growing plants, but what are we tackling? Well, we're tackling restoration. Historical land management, they didn't have to do restoration. They weren't restoring things. They already had things functioning the way they should be. Now we have things functioning the way they're not functioning, or they shouldn't be. So we have to adapt. So I started to think about that, and I started to think about greenhouses and the target plant concept. And I'm like, wow, all this stuff can fit together actually. And I think despite what SER says, I think we can make this work, and we can take this approach where we can get away from the one size fits all approach, and we can create a space where we can be adaptable, we can be creative, we can consider everybody's point of view, and we can create target plants doing this. Yay, target plant concept. I told you I love this. This is really adaptable. I mean, despite its Western science and modern day evolution, I really find it as a great, any one of those points as great potential points in which indigenous inputs can be put in there. So again, you talk about the nursery client relationship. Again, it's like nursery client, tribe, elder, end user relationship, really. What it is, talk about the objectives. How is it going to affect everybody? What are you looking for? And the trophic level consideration. If you don't want fertilizers and pesticides, you're producing target plants in organic methods or methods that you're not going to be worried about, those types of things. You look for education opportunities, and I don't mean this in the Western science sense, but you look for education opportunities in the sense of, I'm doing a restored area. I looked at the traditional folks to find out what used to be there and learn, and what needs to go back there, what's desirable to go back there. Also, too, I think you can look at educational opportunities and where you can promote education for school classrooms, and where you can overlay language and ecology and some of those elements as well. The point being is that I felt like this was a good place where you could start to talk about how these things could weave together really well when you're producing nursery plant materials. So it's not an easy task, but in the last 20 years since our team started this initiative and we started working better with tribal nurseries, you start to realize that, look, it was already being done, or you have a framework to help other tribes get this done, and or it's being done successfully. All these things are coming together in unique and new ways as well. So where you're having the combination of Western seedling production, but you're also integrating ceremony to help round things out and close the circle and make it more relevant in a cultural context. So this is some really cool experiences that I've got to know people doing this and learn about their work over the past years, 20 years. So I'm going to wrap up. I think I'm a little long. I'll wrap up. Target plant for success. It's another tool in the toolbox. How do we tackle the large amount of restoration and reforestation that we need and that we have ahead of us? We have to use all the tools in the toolbox, but we have to learn how to use the tools appropriately to get the job done as best as we can. And how do we incorporate the use of culturally significant plants respectfully? We open up two-way conversations. We build trust. We build relationships, and we find out how to learn from one another. I think nursery produced plants are an excellent tool if they're used appropriately. And I think the TPC, the target plant concept, is a great roadmap to give you an idea on how to do it well. We can realize that Western science and traditional knowledge can work together to create target plants, and it's being done. It's a holistic approach, and I think it's a good way to think about things. One thing I think is important to realize too is that along this journey, that it's important to realize that everything is linked together like a chain. Everything's connected. If you make a change in one part of the process, it's going to affect everything else, and so you have to realize that in order to be successful. It's a circle. It's a feedback loop. It's continually evolving, and if we're not learning, we're not doing it right. So I think I'm a little long. I'm going to finish there. I'm at the end of my talk. I guess now we go into some question and answers, or just maybe some friendly discussion. This is me. This is how you get a hold of me. I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and I